This video is going to recap the structure of a neuron, which is a nerve cell, and we're also going to look at how those neurons connect together in the nervous system to form a structure called a synapse. So, like most cells in the body, neurons will have a nucleus, and that nucleus is going to be housed within a section of cytoplasm, and together we can call these two things the cell body. So the cell body is the nucleus held within a bit of cytoplasm. The cell is going to extend up here this way, so any part of the cell body before, or any part of the cell before the cell body, we call the dendron, whereas any part of the cell after the cell body, we can call that the axon. And that is something students get mixed up with, because they will try and label any small thin part of the cell like this as the axon, but it is important that any part before the cell body is the dendron, whereas any section after the cell body is labelled as the axon. At the end of the axon, you have got these branched structures that we call the axon terminals. So if you were in an airport, the final part, or the final section of the airport that you get to before you board the plane is the terminal. So terminal meaning end, these are axon terminals, meaning they're at the end of the axon. And at this end we also have some branch structures here which we call dendrites. And importantly, both the dendrites and the axon terminals are branched, which allows these cells to link up to other cells in the body. So if you think of a person, is going to need to have nerve cells or neurons stretching around the whole kind of area of their body. So that could potentially be from the brain right down to the toes. So what we'll look at now is kind of how these nerve cells are actually going to link together to allow a person like this to respond to things in their environment. So the first type of cell we'll look at, or the first type of neuron, will be a sensory neuron. So a sensory neuron, if you think of the term sense or sensory, the first part of this is the word sense. So the sensory neuron is going to be the thing that detects or senses different stimuli for the environment. And the way they do that, sensory neurons will always start with a receptor. And the receptor, the role of the receptor is to detect stimuli. So that could be things like chemicals in food or in the air, which you could smell or taste. It could be some kind of pressure stimulus, which you'll be able to feel with kind of pressure receptors. It could be a change in temperature, which you'll be able to feel with receptors in the skin. So this is the receptor structure here. Attached to the receptor is going to be the dendron, which is going to link to this first part of the cell here, which remember we would call that the cell body. Any structure after the cell body would then be the axon, and then at the end of the axon you're going to have these axon terminals. So sensory neurons will lead from the receptor and they will head towards the central nervous system, also called the CNS, and that is made up of the spinal cord as well as the brain. So these neurons can be really long, stretching right away from a receptor in, say, your skin or your eyes to the CNS, central nervous system, which is made up of the spinal cord in the brain. Neurons in the brain and spinal cord tend to be a bit smaller, and we call these neurons either relay neurons. They're also sometimes referred to as intermediate neurons. Okay? And you can see here, just like the sensory neuron, we've got a nucleus with sort of a cell body in here. We've got, this would be the dendron and the dendrites, and then this again would be the axon terminals here. And you can see there's branching on both sides of these, so that actually multiple sensory neurons could connect here. The final neuron in the body is what we call a motor neuron. And a helpful way to remember that this is a motor neuron is always connected to an effector, and the role of the effector is to bring about a response. Okay, so that could be some kind of muscle contraction or relaxation, or it could be a gland releasing some form of hormone. So effectors are always either glands or muscles. So the way I remember that, the last one is always a motor neuron. If you think of a motor is associated with some kind of movement, some kind of response. So that's the way I remember that. The motor neuron is the final neuron because it's linked to the effector. So this section here is actually supposed to represent some form of muscle. And if you look at the structure of the motor neuron, again you can see we've got a cell body here. We've got some dendrites linked to the cell body which can link to other neurons, and then we've got the axon which runs right the way down the middle of the cell, and these are the axon terminals, and then linked to the axon terminal we've got our effector. Now a key point with a motor neuron is the presence of this structure around the outside of the axon which we call the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is going to help to insulate the axon, which was going to allow electrical impulses to travel down them really fast, which is going to be important because these neurons can stretch really long distances. So to carry the neuron really long, to carry the impulse really long distances, it's important that you insulate this neuron with the myelin sheath. And if you look closely, the myelin sheath isn't on the relay neuron because these neurons tend to be so short, there's no need for it. So the last part of this video will explore what happens at this section here. So between here, if you look closely, the neurons don't actually touch together, they're not actually touching. So the gap between two neurons has a special name called a synapse. Now, just like an electrical circuit, if you have a gap in an electrical circuit, the electrical current can't jump across the gap, and it's the same idea. So if this is an axon terminal where one axon ends, and then this here is the neighbouring axon, the dendrite of the next axon, you can see here we've got the gap, and that gap there is called the synapse. So what happens is the electrical impulse, so all nervous impulses are travel around the body as electrical impulse. So we've got an electrical signal travelling down here. What you then have in the cytoplasm of the cell are these vesicles which contain special chemicals which we call neurotransmitters. So as the electrical signal arrives in the axon terminal, it actually causes these vesicles to diffuse or to move towards the cell membrane, and then what they will do is they will release their neurotransmitter. So this actually physically moves along here, it fuses with the membrane, and then it's going to release the neurotransmitter into this gap here, which can be called the synaptic cleft. It's then going to diffuse across, so it's going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. It will then bind to receptors, so there'll be kind of small receptors on the surface here. It will then bind to those receptors, and then when it binds to those receptors, it will then continue as an electrical signal on this side. So the electrical signal can't jump across the gap, so what needs to happen is the neurotransmitter is released, it diffuses across the gap. When it gets to the other side, it then starts a new electrical signal. So what's actually happening in the middle section here is a chemical signal. So key points about a synapse, which is the gap between two neurons, it goes from electrical signal, it converts to a chemical signal as it moves across the gap, and then back to electrical signal. So whenever you have a gap between two neurons, remember that's called a synapse. This is what is going to be occurring at that gap. So electrical signal gets to the end of the axon terminal, neurotransmitters are released, which are chemical signals diffusing across the gap. When it gets to the membrane of the next neuron, that is going to start up a new electrical signal.